Before you close your eyes tonight, ask yourself this. What would you do if looking at something meant instant death? Perseus faced that choice and changed his fate forever. Good evening, sleepless historian. Tonight I want you to imagine something impossible. A prison made not of bars but of bronze. A tower buried beneath the earth, where sunlight never touches stone. And in that darkness, a princess named Danae, locked away because of 4 terrible words spoken by an oracle. Your grandson will kill you. But prophecies, as we'll discover tonight, have a way of finding their path, no matter how many walls we build against them.
Yes.
This is the story of Perseus, the hero who turned a curse into courage, who faced the impossible with nothing but cleverness and divine favor. And as you settle into sleep tonight, let this tale of ancient Greece carry you to a world where monsters were real, gods walked among mortals, and sometimes, just sometimes, the underdog won. Our story begins in the kingdom of Argos, a land where olive groves stretched silver green toward distant mountains, where the Mediterranean sun painted white walls the color of honey, and where the scent of jasmine drifted through palace gardens on warm evening breezes. It was a kingdom that should have known peace, ruled by a man who should have known contentment. But King Acrisius ruled with the kind of fear that makes tyrants, the kind of paranoia that transforms blessings into curses. He had wealth beyond measure, a gold from Egyptian trade, silver from Spanish mines, precious stones that captured light like trapped rainbows. He had power that stretched from the wine-dark sea to the mountain villages, where shepherds sang ancient songs to their flocks. But he had no sons, only a daughter, beautiful Danae, whose very existence had become his curse. Her laughter in the palace corridors reminded him daily of his failure to produce a male heir. Her grace at state dinners mocked his growing desperation. Her gentle questions about marriage and children felt like accusations, for the oracle at Delphi had spoken, and her words echoed in his dreams, like the sound of approaching thunder. You will have no male heir, but your daughter will bear a son, and that son will kill you. The oracle's voice haunted him through sleepless nights, through fevered dreams where he saw his own death reflected in the eyes of an unborn grandson. Every sunset brought him closer to the fulfillment of that terrible prophecy. Every sunrise reminded him that fate was patient but inexorable. Acrisius had consulted every seer in Greece, had offered sacrifices to every god who might listen, had even sent emissaries to the mysterious oracles of Egypt and the wise women of distant Scythia. But the answer was always the same, spoken in different voices, but carrying the same inevitable truth. His death would come through his daughter's bloodline, and no human power could prevent it. So Acrisius, like many who try to outsmart fate, chose the path of cruelty. If Danae never knew a man's touch, how could she bear a child? If she never felt sunlight on her skin, or breathed free air, how could she live the life that would lead to his doom? The decision came to him in the darkest hour of a moonless night, when shadows seemed to whisper encouragement and desperation felt like wisdom. He summoned his most trusted architects, men who had built fortresses against mortal enemies, but had never been asked to construct a prison for fate itself. I need a chamber, he told them, his voice hollow with determination. Underground, bronze walls thick enough to muffle screams, sealed against the world above. Make it comfortable enough that my daughter will not die quickly, but secure enough that she will never ever escape. The architects looked at each other with the careful expressions of men who served a king they no longer understood, but they asked no questions. In ancient Greece, wise men learned when to build and when to stay silent. So he built her a prison, a bronze chamber deep underground, carved into the living rock beneath the palace foundations. The walls were smooth bronze, polished to mirror brightness, reflecting Danae's image back at her in endless repetition, until she felt like she was drowning in her own reflection. The floor was bronze inlaid with silver, beautiful and cold, patterns of flowers and vines that mocked the garden she would never see again. The ceiling was a dome of the finest bronze work, artistic masterpieces that trapped her beneath their beauty like insects preserved in amber. No windows pierced those metal walls, no doors opened from within. The only entrance was through a tunnel that led down from the palace above, a tunnel that was sealed with massive stones once Danae was placed inside. Only a single opening in the ceiling, barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, covered by iron bars and guarded day and night, provided any connection to the world above. Through this opening, her meals descended on ropes, food fit for a princess, served on golden plates that caught the filtered light like small suns. But what the king had forgotten was this: when you try to cage fate, sometimes fate finds the most unexpected ways to break free. Days blurred into weeks in that bronze tomb, weeks into months, months into seasons. Danae, who had once danced in palace gardens and felt sea breezes in her hair, who had read poetry in libraries filled with morning light, and walked through groves where nightingales sang love songs to the moon, now knew only the echo of her own voice against metal walls. She counted time by the patterns of light that filtered down from above, pale and thin at dawn, golden at midday, silver in the evening, gone entirely when clouds covered the sun. The guards above her became her only human contact, and even they were forbidden to speak to her. She knew their shifts by the sound of their footsteps, learned to recognize each man by the particular creak of his leather armor, by the rhythm of his breathing, by the way he cleared his throat or shifted his weight during the long hours of watching. Sometimes she would lie beneath the opening and listen to them talking among themselves, speaking of weather and wages, of wives and children, of the simple freedoms she would never know again. In the beginning, she had raged. She had beaten her fists against the bronze walls until they bled, had screamed until her voice cracked, had torn at her beautiful clothes and pulled at her dark hair in fury that burned like fire in her chest. She had demanded to speak to her father, had pleaded with the guards, had offered them riches beyond imagination, if they would only help her escape. But bronze does not bend to anger, and men who serve tyrants learn deafness as a survival skill. Then had come the despair, rolling over her like winter fog, cold and gray and suffocating. She spent days lying motionless on her beautiful bronze floor, staring at the dome above her, watching dust motes dance in the thin shaft of light like spirits of the freedom she had lost. She refused food until hunger became a constant companion, until her once full figure grew gaunt, and her olive skin turned pale as parchment. She spoke to no one, not even herself, until silence became another prisoner in her bronze tomb. But human beings are remarkably resilient creatures, and princesses raised in comfort often possess an inner strength they never knew they carried. Slowly, gradually, Danae began to adapt to her impossible circumstances. She created routines to mark the passage of time, exercises to keep her body strong, recitations of poetry to keep her mind sharp, songs learned in childhood that filled the silence with memories of happiness. She turned her bronze walls into a canvas for imagination, tracing patterns with her fingers, creating stories from the reflected light, building entire worlds from the interplay of shadow and gleam. She had been an educated princess, raised on Homer's epics and Sappho's lyrics, and now those stories became her companions in the darkness. She recited the Iliad from memory, taking different voices for different heroes, until Achilles and Hector fought their eternal battle in her bronze chamber. She sang Sappho's love songs to walls that had never known affection, her voice growing stronger and sweeter as she transformed loneliness into music. Most importantly, she began to pray, not the formal prayers of palace ceremonies, but the desperate, honest conversations that souls have with divinity when all mortal hope is gone. She prayed to Zeus, king of gods, asking not for rescue but for the strength to endure. She prayed to Hera, protector of women, begging not for freedom, but for purpose in her suffering. She prayed to Athena, goddess of wisdom, seeking not answers but the courage to keep asking questions. And perhaps, In the mystery that surrounds the intersection of divine will and mortal need, those prayers were heard. But the gods, especially Zeus, do not respect the walls of mortals, and divine love finds ways to reach even the most carefully guarded hearts. One afternoon, as Danae lay in her bronze prison 3 years after her imprisonment began, something impossible began to happen. The air itself seemed to shimmer, to dance with possibilities that had no names. The light filtering down from above took on a quality that defied description, not brighter, but more alive, as if the very photons carried consciousness and intent. Golden light, warm and alive, began to pour through the smallest cracks in her ceiling, gaps so tiny that mortal eyes had never noticed them, spaces between bronze plates that seemed solid, but were somehow permeable to divine will. Not ordinary light, this moved like liquid, like honey poured from heaven itself, with a weight and presence that made the bronze chamber feel suddenly vast and full of possibility. Zeus had chosen his form carefully, a shower of golden rain that spoke of abundance and fertility, of divine power made gentle enough for mortal reception. The god who could level mountains with a thought, who commanded lightning and thunder and storm, chose to come to Danae as something beautiful rather than terrible, and as that divine essence filled her chamber, swirling around her like a lover's embrace, Danae felt something she hadn't experienced in years of imprisonment: wonder. The golden rain touched her skin like warm silk, caressed her hair like gentle fingers, filled her lungs with the scent of ambrosia and eternity. It whispered to her in a voice like distant thunder, speaking words that bypassed her ears and resonated directly in her soul. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. You are loved beyond measure. In that impossible moment, as divinity and mortality intertwined in defiance of bronze walls and iron bars, Perseus was conceived, not through violence or conquest, but through a love that transcended the boundaries between immortal and mortal, between free and imprisoned, between hope and despair. In the darkness of her bronze tomb, Danae experienced the most profound light of her existence, and from that union of divine will and human courage, a hero was born. The golden rain faded as gently as it had come, leaving Danae alone again in her bronze chamber, but no longer truly alone. She carried within her body the seed of something greater than mortal understanding, and in her heart, the certainty that her suffering had not been meaningless. She placed her hands on her still flat stomach, and smiled for the first time in 3 years, understanding with maternal instinct that her child would be special, would be powerful, would be the instrument through which her father's cruel prophecy would find its fulfillment. 9 months later, as autumn painted the olive groves bronze and gold, as the Mediterranean cooled from summer's heat, and the first rains of winter whispered promises on the wind, King Acrisius would discover that you cannot imprison the will of the gods, and his greatest fear was about to become his greatest test. The child came at dawn, as heroes often do, entering the world as the sun painted the mountains the color of copper and gold. Danae's labor was fierce but brief, attended only by the echo of her own voice, and the whispered encouragement of deities she could not see but somehow felt. When Perseus took his first breath, the sound echoed through the bronze chamber like a victory cry, and somewhere in the palace above, King Acrisius woke from troubled sleep, with ice in his veins and terror in his heart. The baby's cries carried through the opening in the ceiling with a clarity that defied acoustics, reaching the ears of guards who had grown accustomed to silence from the chamber below. They looked at each other with the pale faces of men who suddenly realized they were witnesses to impossibility, and the bravest among them ran to wake his king with news that would shatter the careful architecture of Acrisius's plans. When the child's cries echoed up from the bronze chamber, King Acrisius felt his blood turn to ice in his veins, felt his carefully constructed world crumble like sand before the tide. He rushed to the opening and peered down through the iron bars, his hands shaking as they gripped the metal, his breath coming in short gasps that misted in the cool dawn air. And there, impossible, unthinkable, but undeniably real, was his daughter holding an infant son, her face radiant with maternal joy that seemed to glow in the bronze-reflected light. The prophecy had found its way even into his perfect prison, had rendered all his precautions meaningless, had mocked his careful planning with the simple fact of divine will. Acrisius stared down at the child who was destined to kill him, at the grandson who carried both his bloodline and his doom, and felt the weight of fate settling on his shoulders like a cloak made of lead and despair. Perseus was beautiful as only divine children can be beautiful, with skin that seemed to glow with inner light, with dark hair that caught the golden dawn like a crown, with eyes that already held depths of wisdom and power that made grown men uncomfortable. Even as an infant, he carried himself with a dignity that belonged to kings and heroes, and when he looked up through the bars at his grandfather, there was recognition in his gaze that transcended mere mortal understanding. Now Acrisius faced a terrible choice that would define not only his own fate but the fate of generations yet unborn. He could murder them both, could order his guards to flood the chamber with oil and set it ablaze, could ensure that the prophecy died with the child who embodied it. But the gods would surely punish him for killing his own blood, for destroying innocent life, for the kind of kinslaying that brought curses down through 7 generations. He could raise the boy himself, could keep him close and watched, could try to shape him into someone incapable of patricide. But then he'd be nurturing his own death, would spend every moment waiting for the fatal blow, would live his remaining years in terror of the child he'd been forced to love. So he chose a third path, one that let him sleep at night while still condemning them to almost certain death, one that technically avoided the sin of murder while achieving the same result. It was the choice of a coward who thought himself clever, of a tyrant who believed he could outwit the gods through technicalities and carefully constructed ambiguities. He ordered a wooden chest to be built, constructed by shipwrights who were told it was for a sacred ritual, who built it strong enough to survive storms, and large enough for a woman and child but small enough to be carried by 4 men. The wood was cedar, blessed by priests who didn't know the true purpose of their prayers, sealed with pitch that would keep out water, but not hope, fitted with bronze hinges that would hold fast against any attempt to escape. As the sun set on what would be Danae's last day in the bronze chamber, as shadows gathered in the palace corridors like conspirators whispering secrets, Acrisius gave the orders that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His guards descended into the bronze chamber, their faces carefully blank, their hands gentle despite their grim purpose. They found Danae clutching Perseus to her breast, her eyes blazing with the fury of a mother protecting her child, her voice ringing with curses that would have made the Furies weep.
"You cannot do this," she cried, her voice echoing off the bronze walls like the sound of breaking hearts. "He is your grandson, your blood, your legacy, and I am your daughter, who loved you before I knew what love could cost." But Acrisius had already killed his heart to make this choice possible, had already transformed love into fear and fear into cruelty. He watched through the opening as his daughter and grandson were placed in the wooden chest, watched as the lid was sealed, watched as 4 strong men carried his own bloodline toward the harbor, where fishing boats rode at anchor in the evening light. The chest was loaded onto a galley manned by sailors who had been told this was a sacred offering to Poseidon, men who rode with the steady rhythm of those who believed they served the gods rather than enabling a king's cruelty. As the ship reached the deep water beyond the harbor, as the coast of Argos faded into the purple distance of evening, the chest was cast into the wine-dark sea with prayers that rang hollow as bronze coins. The waves took them quickly, carrying them away from Argos, away from the known world, into the realm of Poseidon, where only gods and sea monsters decided who lived or died. For 3 days and nights that chest rode the waves like a cork on wine, following currents that had no names and served purposes beyond mortal understanding. Inside, Danae held Perseus close, her voice growing hoarse from singing lullabies that mixed with the sound of water against wood, her hope growing thin as her water ran low and her milk grew scarce. She sang the old songs her own mother had sung, melodies that reached back through generations of royal women who had faced their own impossibilities with courage and grace. She sang of heroes who conquered monsters, of lovers who found each other across impossible distances, of children who grew up to exceed their parents' wildest dreams. And Perseus listened with the intense attention that divine children bring to their mothers' voices, his dark eyes never leaving her face, his small hands grasping at the sound of words that would shape his understanding of what it meant to be human. The chest drifted across waters that have no names, past islands that appear on no maps, through shipping lanes where merchant vessels sailed between the great ports of the ancient world. Dolphins followed them for a time, their sleek forms cutting through the water with joyful grace, and Danae chose to see this as a good omen, a sign that Poseidon himself might be guiding their impossible journey. Seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries mixing with the sound of wind and wave, and sometimes they seemed to be calling words of encouragement, promises that land was near, that rescue awaited just beyond the horizon. The sun rose and set again, painting the water gold and purple and silver, while inside the chest, Danae measured time by Perseus's feeding schedule and her own growing thirst. But on the third dawn, as the first light touched the waves and painted them the color of rose petals and hope, she heard something beautiful, the sound of surf against sand, the gentle rhythm that speaks of beaches, and safety, and solid ground beneath the feet. The chest had found its way to shore, guided by currents that served purposes larger than chance, carried by tides that answered to divine will rather than mortal understanding. They had reached Seriphos, a small island where fishermen cast their nets in waters blessed by gods, where simple people lived simple lives that honored the ancient ways without the corruption that came with too much wealth or power. It was a place where kindness still existed, where strangers were welcomed rather than feared, where the old codes of hospitality still carried the weight of sacred law. And it was one of these fishermen, Dictys, who saw the strange chest bobbing in his nets like the answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was praying. When he pried it open with hands that were strong from hauling nets and gentle from years of caring for wounded seabirds and stranded dolphins, when he found a woman and child inside, alive but barely, he didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions about how they had come to be floating in a sealed chest in the middle of the sea. He didn't wonder about the circumstances that had led to their impossible situation. Instead, he took them to his humble home, a simple structure of whitewashed stone that sat on the hillside overlooking the harbor, where olive trees provided shade and grapevines offered their fruit to any who were hungry. He gave them fresh water from his well, bread from his own oven, goat's milk still warm from the morning milking. He gave them clean clothes and soft blankets, a warm fire and the kind of hospitality that made them feel welcome rather than burdensome. His wife, dead these many years from a fever that no physician could cure, had left him lonely but not bitter, had taught him through her memory that love grows stronger when it's shared rather than hoarded. His house had been too quiet since her passing, too empty of laughter and purpose, and he welcomed Danae and Perseus not just as guests but as the family he had thought he would never have again. Dictys was a good man, and good men were rare in that age of bronze and iron, when kings thought themselves above the laws they imposed on others, when power was measured in gold and slaves rather than wisdom and compassion. He raised Perseus as his own son, teaching him to fish in the early morning when the water was still as glass, and the fish were hungry for the bait of patient fishermen. He taught him to read the stars, to understand the rhythms of sea and season, to predict weather by the color of clouds and the behavior of birds. More importantly, he taught him the values that would serve him better than any weapon. That courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what was right, despite the terror. That honor was not something you claimed but something you earned through countless small choices. That true strength came not from divine blood, but from the willingness to protect those who could not protect themselves. Perseus grew strong and quick-witted under this gentle guidance, with eyes that seemed to hold starlight, and a smile that won hearts throughout the island. The fishermen taught him to mend nets and read currents, the farmers showed him how to coax life from rocky soil, The shepherds shared their knowledge of herbs and healing. He became not just Dictys' son, but the island's child, raised by an entire community that recognized something special in him but loved him for his kindness rather than his potential for greatness. But Perseus carried something in his blood, a restlessness, a hunger for more than the simple life of a fisherman that had nothing to do with dissatisfaction, and everything to do with destiny. As he reached manhood, that divine heritage began to show itself in ways that drew attention from those who understood the signs of power awakening. His strength exceeded that of grown men despite his youth. His reflexes were faster than seemed humanly possible, and there was something in his presence that made both animals and people trust him instinctively. It was this very quality, this spark of something greater, that would soon catch the eye of someone dangerous, someone who would set Perseus on a path toward the most terrifying monster in all the ancient world. King Polydectes ruled Seriphos with the casual cruelty of small men given power over others, the kind of petty tyrant who compensated for his own inadequacies by making others suffer for his entertainment. He was not evil in the grand sense that some kings achieved, not a tyrant who burned cities or sacrificed children to dark gods, not a conqueror who painted his name across the map in blood and suffering. But he was petty, lustful, and completely without honor, the kind of ruler who made life miserable through 1,000 small cruelties rather than one great sin. His palace was a testament to his character, built with forced labor, decorated with art stolen from better men, maintained by servants who served through fear rather than loyalty. The walls were painted with scenes of his imagined glory, frescoes that depicted him as a mighty warrior and wise ruler despite the fact that he had never fought a battle or made a decision that served anyone but himself. His court was filled with flatterers and parasites, men who had sold their honor for comfort, women who had traded their dignity for security. They told him what he wanted to hear, laughed at his crude jokes, applauded his petty victories over peasants and fishermen who couldn't fight back. They created around him a bubble of false reality, where his cruelty seemed like strength, and his selfishness looked like wisdom. And when he saw Danae, now grown into a woman of extraordinary beauty despite her years of hardship, when he watched her walking through the marketplace with the grace of someone who had been raised in palaces but had learned humility through suffering, he decided he wanted her for his wife with the casual entitlement of someone who had never been told no. Danae had aged beautifully in her years on Seriphos. Her youthful prettiness deepened into something richer and more profound. The suffering she had endured had not broken her but had taught her compassion, had shown her that true beauty came from within and grew stronger with wisdom and kindness. She moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced the worst fate could offer, and had emerged not unscathed but undefeated. She had made a life for herself on the island, working alongside the other women in tasks that would have horrified her father but which she had learned to find satisfying, weaving cloth that was both beautiful and practical, tending gardens that fed families, caring for children who needed love more than they needed wealth. She had discovered that happiness did not require palaces or servants, that contentment could be found in simple work done with willing hands. But her beauty had not dimmed with years or hardship, and in a small community where everyone knew everyone else's business, her grace and intelligence had made her the subject of admiration and speculation. Men approached her with the awkward gallantry of those who knew they were reaching above their station, but she turned them all away gently, not from pride but from the understanding that her heart belonged to memories of golden rain and divine love that mortal affection could never replace. There was just one problem with Polydectes' desires: Perseus. The young man had appointed himself his mother's protector with the fierce devotion that divine children bring to those they love, and he was not the kind to step aside politely when a king came calling with dishonorable intentions. Perseus had grown into a man who combined his grandfather's royal bearing with his foster father's integrity, who possessed his divine father's strength tempered by his mother's compassion. When Polydectes first approached Danae with his crude propositions, when he made it clear that he considered her consent optional and her resistance temporary, Perseus had intervened with a directness that surprised everyone. He had not threatened or blustered, had not challenged the king to combat or made dramatic speeches about honor. He had simply stood between his mother and the king, arms crossed, eyes steady, and spoken words that carried the quiet authority of absolute determination. My mother is not interested in your attention. I would suggest you look elsewhere for companionship. The confrontation had taken place in the marketplace, witnessed by half the island, and Polydectes had been forced to retreat with as much dignity as he could muster. But the humiliation burned in him like poison, and kings, even petty kings of small islands, were not accustomed to being refused by fishermen's sons, no matter how impressive those sons might be. Polydectes needed to remove this obstacle, but he couldn't simply have Perseus killed. The young man was too well loved on the island, too obviously innocent of any crime beyond protecting his mother's honor. Besides, Perseus had a reputation for cleverness and quick reflexes that made direct confrontation unwise for a man whose greatest battle had been against his own wine cup. So Polydectes chose cunning over strength, chose manipulation over honest challenge, chose the path of cowards who mistake treachery for strategy. He began to plan Perseus's destruction with the patience of someone who understood that the best traps were baited with pride and seasoned with impossible choices. The plan, when it came to him, was elegant in its simplicity and cruel in its design. He announced his intention to marry Hippodamia, a distant princess whose beauty was legendary throughout the Greek world, whose father demanded wedding gifts that would bankrupt kingdoms and prove the worth of any suitor brave enough to court her. It was a lie, of course. Polydectes had no intention of marrying anyone whose father might object to his methods, but it provided the perfect excuse for what came next. He declared that every man on the island must bring him a wedding gift worthy of such a union, a present that would demonstrate their loyalty to their king and their support for his matrimonial ambitions. The announcement was made with great ceremony, with trumpets and proclamations, with speeches about honor and loyalty that rang hollow as coins dropped on stone. The other islanders began to prepare their offerings. The wealthy brought horses, the metal workers offered precious vessels, the farmers contributed their finest livestock. Even poor men scraped together what they could, understanding that failure to participate would be seen as disloyalty and punished accordingly. But Perseus, who owned nothing but the clothes on his back and his father's fishing nets, who had no gold or silver or precious goods to offer, found himself empty-handed when the day of presentation arrived. He stood in the great hall of Polydectes' palace, surrounded by other men displaying their gifts, painfully aware that he alone had come with nothing to offer. This was exactly what Polydectes had hoped for, in front of the entire court, with witnesses who would remember his words and spread them throughout the island. He smiled his coldest smile and spoke the words that would change Perseus's life forever. "Since you have no gift suitable for a king, Perseus, son of no one important, perhaps you could bring me something truly impressive instead. Bring me the head of Medusa, the Gorgon whose gaze turns men to stone." The court fell silent as death, understanding that they were witnessing not a request but an execution disguised as a challenge. Everyone knew this was not a gift, it was a death sentence. No one who had ever sought Medusa had returned to tell the tale. No hero, however brave or skilled, had ever survived an encounter with the Gorgon, whose very gaze meant instant death. But Perseus looked King Polydectes in the eye, saw the cruel satisfaction there, understood exactly what game was being played, and what stakes were involved. He could refuse, could admit that the task was impossible, could accept the humiliation and hope that his mother would be safe. Or he could accept, could walk willingly toward almost certain death, could choose the hero's path despite knowing where it led. The choice, when it came, was not really a choice at all. Perseus had been raised by a man who taught him that honor was more important than life, by a woman who had shown him that courage could transform curses into blessings. He had divine blood in his veins and mortal love in his heart, and both demanded the same response. "I accept," Perseus said simply, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent hall like the sound of fate closing its hand around destiny. And with those two words, he sealed his fate, though whether it would be death or glory, only the gods knew. The court erupted in whispers and gasps, in expressions of awe and pity, in the kind of excited murmurs that people make when they witness the moment when ordinary life transforms into legend. Polydectes smiled with the satisfaction of a spider watching a fly enter its web, already anticipating the news of Perseus's death and the removal of the last obstacle between himself and Danae.
But the gods were watching too, and they had their own plans for the young man who had just volunteered to face the impossible. The Gorgons were 3 sisters, born from ancient sea deities in the early days of the world, when the boundaries between beauty and horror had not yet been firmly established, when love and death danced together in forms that modern minds could barely comprehend. Their names were Stheno, Uriel, and Medusa, words that tasted like salt and blood when spoken aloud, that carried the weight of primordial power and ancient curse. The first 2, Stheno and Uriel, were immortal, their bronze hands capable of tearing apart mountains, their golden wings strong enough to carry them across oceans without rest, their gaze deadly beyond measure to any mortal creature unfortunate enough to meet their eyes. They had been born terrible and would remain terrible until the end of time, perfect in their monstrosity, complete in their function as guardians of the boundary between life and stone. But Medusa was mortal, which meant she could be killed. It also meant she could suffer, could remember what she had lost, could feel the weight of her transformation every moment of her cursed existence. Once, in the golden days before her curse, she had been beautiful beyond description. Not beautiful in the way that mortal women were beautiful, but beautiful in the way that made gods stop their eternal games and stare in wonder. Beautiful in the way that made poets weep because words could never capture what their eyes had seen. Her hair had been like spun silk, her eyes like pools of starlight, her voice like the song that the spheres sing as they dance through heaven. She had served as a priestess in Athena's temple, dedicating her beauty and her life to the goddess of wisdom, taking vows of chastity that seemed like small sacrifices when balanced against the honor of serving divinity. She had tended the sacred flame, had spoken the ritual words that welcomed suppliants, had lived a life of quiet devotion that should have earned her protection rather than punishment. But Poseidon, the earth shaker, the lord of horses and earthquakes and the wine-dark sea, had seen her beauty and desired it with the consuming hunger that gods bring to their passions. And in his typical fashion, for the gods of Greece were powerful, but not particularly moral, he had taken what he wanted by force, right there in Athena's sacred temple, defiling both the priestess and the holy ground in a single act of divine selfishness. Any reasonable person would have expected Athena to punish Poseidon for this violation, to defend her servant and her sanctuary against the ravages of divine lust. But gods do not operate by the rules of justice that mortals understand, and Athena, wise in all things except perhaps the management of her own anger, chose to punish the victim rather than the perpetrator. Perhaps she understood that challenging Poseidon directly would lead to a war between gods that would devastate the mortal world. Perhaps she felt that Medusa should have resisted more strongly, should have chosen death over defilement. Or perhaps she simply needed someone to bear the weight of her rage, and Medusa was more vulnerable than the earth shaker. Whatever her reasoning, Athena's punishment was swift and terrible and permanent. She transformed Medusa's lovely hair into writhing snakes that hissed and coiled with independent malice, creatures that whispered poisoned thoughts and bitter memories into their hosts' ears. She made her face so hideous that anyone who looked upon it would turn instantly to stone, would lose not just life but the very essence of what made them human. Most cruelly of all, she left Medusa's mind intact, left her capable of understanding exactly what she had become and what she had lost. The former priestess retained her memories of beauty and devotion, her capacity for love and hope and all the emotions that made existence meaningful, but she could never again experience human connection without destroying the very people she might wish to love. Now Medusa lived at the edge of the world, in a place where night never lifted and day never truly arrived.
where the sun's chariot passed overhead like a distant rumor rather than a source of light and warmth. She dwelt in a grove of trees that had long since turned to stone, their branches reaching toward a sky they could no longer touch, their leaves frozen in eternal autumn that knew no change or renewal. Around her, scattered like a nightmare garden, stood the stone statues of heroes and kings and common men who had tried to slay her and failed, each one captured in their final moment, their faces reflecting the progression from confidence to terror to the blank emptiness of stone. Warriors with their swords raised, their mouths open in battle cries that would never come. Sailors with their hands shading their eyes, still searching for home across seas they would never sail again. Kings and beggars and children, all equal in their final moment, all victims of a single glance from eyes that had once reflected starlight and now held only death. It was to this place that Perseus would have to travel, somehow kill an unkillable monster, and return with proof of his deed. The task seemed not just difficult but actively impossible, a challenge designed to ensure failure rather than test heroism. But Perseus had something those other heroes lacked, not just courage or skill, though he possessed both in abundance, not just divine blood, though Zeus's heritage ran strong in his veins. He had something rarer and more powerful, the favor of the gods themselves, earned not through arrogance or ambition, but through the simple virtue of standing up for those who could not protect themselves. Athena came to him first, appearing in his dreams as he struggled with the knowledge of what he had promised to do, manifesting as a woman of impossible beauty wrapped in armor that caught starlight and held it like captured music. Her gray eyes reflected depths of wisdom and calculation that made mortal intelligence seem like candle flame compared to the sun, and when she spoke her words carried the weight of absolute authority. "You have accepted a task that destroyed better men than you," she said, her voice like wind through silver bells, "but you did not accept it from pride or ambition. You accepted it from love, and love sometimes accomplishes what strength cannot." She had her own reasons for wanting Medusa dead. Monster's very existence was a reminder of her own harsh justice, a living testament to the complexity of divine decision-making, and perhaps, in her divine heart, she felt something like regret for the cruelty of her punishment. The priestess who had served her faithfully had been transformed into a creature of nightmare, and while Athena would never admit to making a mistake, she could at least provide the means for correcting the consequences of her choices. She gave Perseus a shield, polished to mirror brightness, its bronze surface reflecting light with perfect clarity, its weight perfectly balanced for a warrior's arm, and with the gift came words that would save his life. "Never look directly at the Gorgon, young hero, use only reflections. The image in bronze cannot kill, though the reality behind it remains deadly beyond measure." Hermes arrived next, swift-footed and grinning, carrying gifts that defied mortal understanding, and seemed to bend the laws of physics through sheer divine will. The messenger god appeared as Perseus walked along the shore, materializing from sea spray and morning light, like a figure stepped out of sailors' dreams. "My brother's son," Hermes said, his voice carrying the sound of wind over water and the laughter of dolphins at play. "You have chosen a path that would challenge gods, much less mortals, but perhaps that divine foolishness runs in the family." The gifts he brought were wonders beyond price, winged sandals that would carry Perseus through the air as easily as a man walks on earth, their feathers responding to thought rather than physical effort, their magic drawing power from the winds themselves. A curved sword, adamantine and sharp enough to cut through bronze, through bone, through the very fabric of reality if necessary, its blade holding an edge that would never dull and never break. And most importantly, directions to the Grey sisters who shared a single eye and tooth between them, ancient beyond measure, who alone knew the secret path to the Gorgon's lair, and could provide the final tools necessary for Perseus's impossible task. "Find the Grey Ones," Hermes instructed, his words carrying the weight of prophecy and warning. "But beware, they are ancient and cunning, older than the mountains, wiser than the sea. They will not give their knowledge freely, and they guard their secrets with the jealousy of those who have little else to possess. The Graeae lived at the very edge of civilization, in a twilight realm where day and night blurred together like watercolors in rain, where the normal rules of time and space held less authority than they did in the lands where mortals built their cities. The journey to find them took Perseus across waters that had no names, over islands that appeared on no maps, through regions where reality itself seemed negotiable. He flew on Hermes' winged sandals, learning to trust the magic that carried him, learning to read the winds and currents that would guide him toward his destination. Below him, the Mediterranean spread like a wine-dark carpet stitched with islands of white stone and green olive groves, dotted with the sails of merchant ships whose crews would look up and see him passing overhead like some impossible bird. The Graeae's dwelling place existed in the space between day and night, in the eternal twilight that belongs neither to sun nor moon, but to something older and stranger than either. Perseus found them sitting by their gray fire, three ancient women whose hair had long since turned the color of ash, and whose skin bore the pallor of those who had lived too long away from sunlight. They were old beyond mortal comprehension, old in the way that mountains are old in the way that stars are old with the patient endurance of those who have watched civilizations rise and fall like waves against the shore. Their gray clothes hung on frames that seemed fragile as dried leaves, but their eyes, or rather, their single shared eye, burned with intelligence that made mortal wisdom seem like child's babbling. They sat in eternal conversation, passing their single eye from hand to hand so each could take her turn at seeing, their voices weaving together in discussions that had been continuing for centuries and might continue for centuries more. They spoke of things that had been and things that might be, of the secret names of gods and the hidden purposes of fate, of knowledge so dangerous that it could only be shared among those who had already passed beyond the reach of mortal consequences. Perseus watched them from hiding, concealed behind rocks that had been worn smooth by winds that carried the dreams of sleeping gods, learning their rhythm, waiting for his moment. He studied the pattern of their eye-sharing, timed the intervals between exchanges, prepared himself for the single moment when opportunity and necessity would intersect. And when that moment came, when one sister passed the eye to another in the casual gesture of those who had performed the same action countless times, Perseus moved with a speed and cleverness that would have made Hermes himself proud. As one sister extended her hand to receive their shared sight, as another sister reached out to relinquish it, Perseus darted forward like a striking hawk and snatched the eye from between them. It was warm in his palm, heavy with the weight of accumulated vision, pulsing with a light that seemed to come from within rather than without. Suddenly blind, all three sisters wailed and clawed the air with hands like gnarled branches, their voices rising in harmony that spoke of loss and violation and rage beyond measure. They searched for their precious sight with desperate fingers, their movements growing more frantic as they realized that their treasure was gone, that they were helpless without the one eye that allowed them to navigate their twilight world. "Give it back," they cried in voices like wind through dead leaves. "Give us back our sight, thief, robber, violator of ancient law." But Perseus held the eye just out of their reach, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what he had done. "I have your eye, grandmother's, and I will return it to you gladly. But first you must tell me what I need to know. Tell me the path to the Gorgon's lair, and tell me where I can find the sacred items that will allow me to survive what I must do." The Graeae had no choice, and all four of them knew it. They were ancient and powerful, but their power was useless without sight, and their wisdom was meaningless if they could not perceive the world around them. In voices that rustled like autumn leaves falling onto stone, voices that carried the weight of countless years and bitter experience, they told him what he needed to know. "The nymphs," whispered the first sister, her blind eyes turning toward the sound of his voice with desperate attention. "Seek the nymphs who dwell in the garden beyond the sunset, who guard the treasures that heroes need." "Hades' helm of invisibility," added the second sister, her words heavy with the weight of dangerous knowledge. "The bag of holding that can contain what should not be contained." These things they possess, these things they guard. And the Gorgons themselves, concluded the third sister, her voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to carry across vast distances. They dwell at the edge of night, where Atlas holds up the sky and the sun's chariot fears to travel. In the grove of stone trees, surrounded by those who failed before you. Perseus listened carefully, committing every detail to memory, understanding that his life would depend on the accuracy of what he was hearing. When they had finished, when they had given him everything he needed to know, he gently placed their eye where they could find it, and stepped back into the shadows. "Thank you, grandmothers," he said, his voice carrying genuine gratitude despite the circumstances of their meeting. "I will remember your wisdom, and I will honor the trust you have given me." The Grey said nothing in response, but as Perseus departed, he heard one of them speak words that followed him like a benediction. "May your purpose be just, young hero, for justice is the only shield that protects those who face the impossible." Perseus flew westward, following directions that led him past the pillars of Heracles, beyond the edge of maps where merchant captains marked their charts with warnings about sea monsters and boiling water, to islands that existed only in the dreams of the most desperate sailors. The world grew stranger as he traveled, the very air taking on qualities that defied description, the light itself seeming to carry meanings that mortal minds were not equipped to understand. There he found the nymphs, beautiful beyond description, eternal and kind, creatures of such perfect loveliness that looking at them was like listening to music made visible, like breathing air that had been distilled from laughter and starlight. They dwelt in a garden that existed outside of normal geography, where every flower bloomed in perfect perpetuity, where streams ran uphill when they chose to, and gravity was more a suggestion than a law. The nymphs gathered around Perseus like children, greeting a beloved uncle, their faces bright with curiosity and affection, their voices ringing like silver bells in morning air. They had watched his journey through their scrying pools, had seen his kindness to his mother, and his courage in the face of impossible odds, and they looked at this young mortal with something like maternal affection.
"We know why you have come," their leader said, her voice like water running over smooth stones. "We know what you face, and we know what you will need. But first, tell us, do you go to glory or do you go from love?" "I go from love," Perseus answered without hesitation. "I go to protect my mother, to honor the man who raised me, to fulfill a promise that honor demanded I make." The nymphs smiled at this answer, recognizing truth when they heard it, understanding that the motivations that drove heroes mattered more than the strength of their arms or the sharpness of their swords. They gave him everything the Grey had promised, and something more: Hades' helm of invisibility, a crown of darkness that would hide him from the Gorgon's sight, that would make him undetectable to senses both mortal and divine. The bag of holding, woven from materials that existed only in the space between dimensions, capable of containing things that should not be contained without affecting the bearer, and most crucially, exact directions to the Gorgon's resting place, knowledge purchased with the tears of heroes who had tried and failed. But more than material gifts, they gave him words of encouragement that would sustain him through the darkness ahead. "You carry the blood of Zeus in your veins, young hero, but more importantly, you carry love in your heart, and sometimes mortal courage burns brighter than divine power." Armed with gifts from gods and nymphs, carrying the hopes of those who loved him and the expectations of those who had dismissed him, Perseus finally turned toward his destination. But nothing, not divine favor, not magical weapons, not all the courage in the world, could truly prepare him for what he would find at the edge of darkness. The flight to the Gorgon's lair carried Perseus beyond the Western Ocean, past regions where normal navigation failed, and compasses spun uselessly in their housings, toward a realm where Atlas held up the sky and the sun's chariot never rode. The very air grew colder and thinner as he traveled, taking on a quality that seemed to absorb light rather than transmit it, that carried sounds farther than they should travel and muffled others that should have echoed clearly.
He flew through air that grew colder and thinner with each mile, over waves that reflected no light, despite the presence of stars overhead, toward a darkness that seemed to swallow even hope. The normal rules of the world grew weaker here, in this place where titans had been chained and gods feared to walk, where reality itself seemed less certain and more negotiable. The first sign that he was approaching his destination came through his sense of smell, the copper scent of blood that had been spilled long ago and never properly cleaned, the sweet decay of death that lingered in places where life ended violently, and underneath it all, something else that had no name but made his stomach clench with primal fear, an odor that spoke to parts of his mind that remembered when humans were prey, rather than hunters. Then he saw the statues. At first, they appeared to be a single monument in the distance, a pale structure that caught the dim light and reflected it like captured moonbeams. But as he drew closer, flying lower to get a better view, Perseus realized that what he was seeing was not one statue but thousands, an army of stone figures stretching as far as his enhanced vision could see in the eternal twilight. They were arranged in no particular order, frozen in their final moments like a museum of last moments, a gallery of terror preserved in marble and granite and bronze. Warriors in mid-charge, their swords raised above their heads, their mouths open in battle cries that would never come, their eyes wide with the realization that courage alone was not enough to save them. Sailors with their hands shading their eyes, still searching for home across seas they would never sail again, their faces turned toward distant shores that might as well have been in another world. Kings and beggars and children, all equal in their final moment, all victims of a single glance from eyes that had once reflected starlight and now held only death. Each statue was perfect in its execution, capturing not just the physical form but something of the personality that had inhabited it. The proud tilt of a warrior's chin, the gentle curve of a mother's hand reaching for a child she would never touch again, the desperate hope in a young man's eyes as he realized that heroism was not enough to guarantee survival. Perseus flew among them like a ghost, his winged sandals carrying him silently over ground littered with broken weapons and crumbling bones, with the remnants of quests that had ended in failure and dreams that had turned to nightmare. He saw weapons that had been forged by master smiths, armor that had been blessed by priests, talismans that had been carried by men who believed themselves protected by gods or luck, or fate. None of it had mattered. The Gorgon's curse recognized no hierarchy of courage or virtue, acknowledged no difference between the brave and the cowardly, the noble and the base. It turned all flesh to stone with perfect democracy, perfect equality, perfect finality. And beyond them, in a grove of trees that had long since turned to stone, their branches reaching toward a sky they could no longer touch, their leaves frozen in eternal autumn that knew no change or renewal, the Gorgons slept. Perseus activated Hades' helm, and felt the strange sensation of existing without being seen, of occupying space without casting shadow, of breathing without disturbing the air around him. He became invisible not just to sight, but to the deeper senses that gods and monsters possessed, becoming a gap in reality rather than a presence within it. Step by careful step, he moved through the forest of the dead, his winged sandals carrying him silently over ground that crunched with fragments of stone that had once been human bone. His heart hammered so loudly in his chest that he was certain it would wake them, but the Gorgons slept on, their breathing creating small whirlwinds in the dust that surrounded them. Now came the moment that would define him forever, the instant when all his preparation and divine favor would either prove sufficient or fail catastrophically. Perseus raised Athena's shield, angled it just so, adjusting the bronze surface until he could see what lay before him reflected in its polished surface. And in that reflection, dulled by bronze but still terrible beyond description, he saw the face that had launched 1,000 nightmares. Even in reflection, even dulled by the medium of bronze, Medusa's visage was terrible beyond words, beyond imagination, beyond the capacity of human minds to process without breaking. Her hair writhed with serpents, each one alive and independent, each one watching with eyes like black pearls that held malice older than civilization. The snakes moved with hypnotic rhythm, coiling and uncoiling in patterns that seemed to carry meaning, that whispered promises of death and transformation to anyone who watched too long. Her face was still recognizably that of a woman, but twisted into something that belonged in the deepest pits of Tartarus, rather than in the world where mortals drew breath and felt sunlight on their skin. The bone structure that had once been beautiful now served as the framework for horror, the elegant lines of cheek and jaw transformed into something that spoke of predation and hunger, and the joy that came from ending life. Her bronze skin gleamed with an oily sheen that seemed to shift and move in the dim light, and her lips pulled back in an eternal snarl that revealed teeth, like broken glass, like daggers carved from ivory, like promises of pain written in enamel and bone. But it was her eyes that were the worst eyes that had once reflected starlight and divine love, now holding depths of hatred and despair that seemed to go down forever, that promised anyone who looked into them directly that death would be a mercy compared to what they would experience first. But Perseus looked, and Perseus did not turn to stone, because he looked only at her reflection, because Athena's wisdom had provided the key to survival in a situation where courage alone would have meant death. With movements precise as a surgeon's, disciplined as a master craftsman's, he raised Hermes' blade and positioned himself over the sleeping Gorgon. The sword felt alive in his hands, vibrating with divine power, eager to complete the task for which it had been forged. Perseus could feel its hunger for justice, its desire to end the suffering of the creature that lay before him, to release both Medusa and the world from the curse that bound them both in endless cycles of death and horror. With one swift stroke, guided by divine will and mortal determination, he brought the blade down through flesh and bone, an ancient curse, the adamantine edge passing through its target, as if it were made of mist rather than flesh. The sword sang as it cut, a note of pure music that spoke of ending and resolution, of cycles completed and debts finally paid. Medusa's head rolled free, severed cleanly at the neck, her serpent hair still writhing in death, her eyes still deadly even though the life had left them. But Perseus was ready, guided by instructions that had been burned into his memory, prepared for this moment through divine foresight and careful planning. Without looking directly at his prize, guided only by the sound of its movement and the disturbed air that marked its passage, he swept the head into the magical bag that the nymphs had provided. The instant Medusa died, releasing the soul that had been trapped in monstrous form for centuries, her sisters woke from their eternal slumber with screams that shattered the air like breaking crystal, like the sound of mountains falling, like the cry of the world itself in pain. Steno and Uriel rose into the night sky on their golden wings, their bronze claws extended, their immortal voices raised in cries of vengeance that would echo across the heavens until time itself ended. But Perseus was already invisible, already flying, already racing toward home with his impossible prize secure in its divine container. Behind him, the Gorgon's cries faded into distance as they searched in vain for the hero who had accomplished what no mortal had ever achieved, who had brought death to the unkillable and justice to the cursed. Behind him, the Gorgon's cries faded into distance as they searched the endless twilight for an enemy they could not see, could not touch, could not punish for the loss they had suffered. Ahead lay the long journey home, but Perseus carried with him something that would change not just his fate, but the fate of everyone whose life he touched. From Medusa's spilled blood, as it dripped onto the earth and mingled with soil that had been waiting for this moment since the beginning of time, sprang two impossible children born of death and divinity. Pegasus, the winged horse whose hoofbeats would thunder across the sky in years to come, whose rider would achieve fame that echoed Perseus's own, and Chrysaor, the golden-armed warrior, who would found kingdoms and father heroes, whose descendants would carry the blood of gods and monsters into the distant future. Even in death, the Gorgon's power created wonders, proved that destruction and creation were merely different faces of the same cosmic force, demonstrated that endings were often beginnings in disguise. Perseus flew eastward through skies that seemed clearer now, as if Medusa's death had lifted some ancient curse from the world itself, as if the balance between life and death had been restored to its proper harmony. He carried his burden carefully, never looking into the bag, never relaxing his vigilance, understanding that the head of Medusa was perhaps the most dangerous object in all the world, a weapon that could turn armies to stone with a single glance, that could end wars or start them depending on who wielded it and how. But fate was not finished with Perseus yet, for heroes' paths are never straight, and the gods enjoy complications that test character as much as courage. As he passed over the coast of Ethiopia, following air currents that would carry him home to Seriphos and the confrontation that awaited him there, he heard sounds that made him pause in his flight, the crash of waves against stone, and beneath it, something else that called to the part of him that could not ignore suffering. The sound of weeping, carried on the wind like a prayer without words. He descended through clouds and mist, and saw a sight that would haunt his dreams forever. A young woman chained to a sea rock by bonds that gleamed like silver in the late afternoon light, her white dress whipping in the wind like a banner of surrender, her dark hair streaming behind her like a war standard in retreat. The tide was rising around her feet, each wave reaching higher than the last, and in the distance something vast and terrible was moving beneath the waves, creating swells that spoke of size and hunger and approaching doom. This was Andromeda, princess of Ethiopia, and she was about to die for her mother's vanity. But Perseus was about to discover that sometimes the greatest heroism comes not from seeking glory, but from simply refusing to look away when others suffer. The story was simple and terrible, as the best stories often are, the kind of tale that revealed the complexity of divine justice and the price of mortal pride. Queen Cassiopeia, Andromeda's mother, had committed the sin that gods found most unforgivable. She had compared mortal beauty to divine perfection, and found the divine wanting. In her maternal pride, in her joy at her daughter's extraordinary loveliness, she had boasted publicly that Andromeda was more beautiful than the Nereids, the sea nymphs who attended Poseidon and whose beauty was legendary throughout the ancient world. Such hubris never went unpunished by gods who measured their worth partly by the worship and fear they inspired in mortals. Poseidon, whose pride was as vast as the oceans he ruled, had taken offense at this slight to his attendants, had decided that mortal presumption required correction on a scale that would serve as a lesson to future generations. He had sent a sea monster from the deepest trenches of his realm, a creature of nightmare and hunger, that had risen from depths where sunlight never penetrated, where pressure would crush mountains and darkness held weight. The beast had ravaged the Ethiopian coast for months, destroying ships and fishing fleets, consuming anyone foolish enough to venture into the water, turning the sea from a source of life and prosperity into a realm of terror and death. The oracle, consulted in desperation by a king who watched his kingdom dying ship by ship, fisherman by fisherman, had declared that only one sacrifice could appease the god's wrath. Andromeda herself must be chained to the rocks and given to the beast, must pay with her life for her mother's words, must serve as the price of peace between divine anger and mortal need. Perseus hovered above the scene, invisible in his helm of darkness, torn between his mission and his conscience, between the duty he owed to his mother and the obligation he felt to innocence in peril. He could continue home, could complete his quest, could save Danae from Polydectes' unwanted attention and claim the victory that would secure their future. Or he could intervene, could risk everything he had gained, could gamble his life and his prize for a stranger whose only crime was being born to a foolish mother. He looked at Andromeda's face, beautiful, yes, but more than that, brave. She was not screaming or pleading with the gods for rescue that would not come. She was not cursing her mother or her fate, or the circumstances that had brought her to this moment. She faced her death with a dignity that humbled him, with a courage that put his own heroism in perspective, with the kind of grace that reminded him that true nobility had nothing to do with divine blood and everything to do with the choices people made when everything was taken from them. The choice when it came was not really a choice at all. Perseus had been taught by Dictys that honor meant protecting those who could not protect themselves, had learned from his mother that love meant sacrifice, had discovered through his own experience that heroism was meaningless unless it served something greater than personal glory.
Perseus descended like a falling star, drawing his sword, calling out to the princess in a voice that carried across the wind and waves, "Look away, no matter what you hear, no matter what sounds reach your ears, do not turn your eyes toward me." The sea monster that rose from the depths in response to his arrival was nightmare given form, the kind of creature that lived in the spaces between sleeping and waking, that embodied every fear that sailors carried in their hearts when they ventured beyond sight of land. It was everything the ocean fears condensed into living flesh, tentacles thick as tree trunks and strong enough to crush ships, eyes like pools of black water that reflected nothing and promised everything, teeth that could shatter the hulls of war galleys like they were made of parchment and dreams. The beast surged toward Andromeda with hunger that had been building for weeks, with the satisfaction of something that knew its meal was helpless, was chained, was waiting for death with the patience of the damned. Its roar split the air like thunder, like the sound of mountains falling into the sea, like the cry of the abyss itself given voice. But Perseus was ready, and he had learned something important in the Gorgon's lair. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is not strength, but the wisdom to use your enemy's power against them. As the monster lunged forward, as its massive form broke the surface in a spray of foam and fury, as its mouth opened to reveal rows of teeth like broken promises, Perseus reached into his bag and drew forth Medusa's head. Even the sea beast, ancient and terrible and born from divine wrath, could not resist the Gorgon's final curse, could not survive the gaze that turned all living things to stone. The transformation was instant and absolute. The monster's roar cut off mid-bellow as its flesh hardened, as its muscles became marble, as its rage became sculpture. For a moment it hung suspended above the waves like a monument to divine justice, like a statue carved by gods to commemorate the power of heroism over horror. Then it crashed into the sea with the sound of avalanches, of temples falling, of the earth itself reshaping. Waves erupted from the impact, sending spray high enough to catch the last light of the setting sun, and when the water cleared, the monster was gone, sunk beneath the waves like a mountain that had chosen to become part of the ocean floor. Perseus quickly concealed the head again, understanding that even a moment's carelessness could mean his own death, could transform his victory into tragedy. He flew to Andromeda's side with speed that defied mortal understanding, his hands already working at the chains that bound her to the rock, his divine strength making quick work of bonds that had been forged to hold against mortal rescue attempts. As he broke her chains, as freedom returned to limbs that had been bound for hours, Andromeda looked at him with eyes that held stars, with an expression of wonder and gratitude, and something deeper, something that Perseus felt echoing in his own chest, like the sound of recognition. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice carrying the music that came from speaking to someone who had just saved your life, who had chosen to risk everything for a stranger's welfare, someone who believes beautiful women should not die for their mother's mistakes. He replied, and even as he spoke the words, he knew that something had changed in the fundamental architecture of his life, that his quest was no longer just about saving his mother, or proving his worth, but about something larger and more complicated and infinitely more precious. But their escape from Ethiopia would prove to be only the beginning of their trials, for Perseus still had to return home, still had to claim his victory over Polydectes, and still had to confront the prophecy that had started everything. They flew together across the wine-dark sea, Andromeda in Perseus's arms, both of them marveling at the impossible turn their lives had taken, at the way fate had brought them together through circumstances that should have led to death rather than love. The winged sandals carried them both easily, their magic responding to Perseus's will and adjusting to the additional weight without strain or effort. As they traveled, as the Mediterranean spread beneath them like a map written in moonlight and starshine, they talked with the intensity of people who had faced death and discovered life on the other side. Andromeda told him of her homeland, of the books she had read in her father's library, where scholars from across the known world had gathered their wisdom, of her dreams of seeing the world beyond Ethiopia's borders, of experiencing the freedom that had been denied to her by the circumstances of royal birth. She spoke of her love for her people, of her understanding that her sacrifice had been necessary to save them, of her acceptance of death that had made her rescue feel like resurrection. Her voice carried the wisdom that came from facing the worst fate could offer and finding peace with it, the kind of maturity that suffering could teach to those strong enough to learn from it rather than be broken by it. Perseus told her of his mission, of the mother imprisoned by a tyrant's lust, of the impossible task that had seemed like a death sentence but had become the path to the greatest adventure of his life. He spoke of his divine heritage and his mortal upbringing, of the fisherman who had taught him that honor was more valuable than gold, of the strange destiny that had driven him to the edge of the world and back. By the time they reached the familiar waters around Seriphos, by the time the island's hills appeared on the horizon like old friends welcoming them home, they knew they would never part again, that their lives had become intertwined by something stronger than choice or circumstance, something that poets called fate and lovers called destiny. But the island they found was not the peaceful fishing community Perseus remembered, was not the simple place where good men lived. Simple lives and kindness was valued more than wealth or power. Polydectes had grown tired of waiting, had decided that Perseus was certainly dead, and that his obstinate honor had died with him. He had taken Danae by force, had imprisoned her in his palace, had declared himself her husband whether she willed it or not, had claimed her as his prize for his patience and his victory over her protector. Dictys, the kind fisherman who had raised Perseus, who had shown him what it meant to be a good man in a world that rarely rewarded goodness, lay dead in the palace courtyard. He had been killed for trying to protect Danae, for standing up to power with nothing but moral authority as his weapon, for choosing to die with honor rather than live with the shame of abandoning those he loved. Perseus felt rage like he had never known, pure and clean and terrible, the kind of anger that burned away everything except the need for justice, that transformed grief into purpose and sorrow into strength. This was not the hot fury of youth, or the blind rage of gods, but something colder and more focused, something that calculated the price of cruelty and prepared to collect it with interest. He walked into Polydectes' palace with Andromeda at his side, through corridors lined with the king's guards, who had expected never to see him again, into the great hall where the tyrant sat on his stolen throne like a spider in its web, surrounded by the flatterers and parasites who had enabled his cruelty. "I have returned," Perseus announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent hall like the sound of judgment arriving, like the whisper of fate settling its accounts. "And I have brought the gift you requested." Polydectes laughed, thinking himself safe behind his guards and his power, thinking that whatever tricks this upstart fisherman's son might attempt, they could not threaten a king in his own palace surrounded by his own men. But he had forgotten something important about Perseus. The young man had learned to turn impossible situations to his advantage. "You expect me to believe you have actually slain Medusa?" Polydectes sneered, his voice carrying the casual contempt of someone who had never doubted his own superiority, who had mistaken cruelty for strength and cowardice for wisdom. "Show me this great trophy, hero. Show us all your supposed victory, this impossible deed that no real hero has ever accomplished." The courtiers laughed at their king's words, the nervous laughter of those who were complicit in injustice, who had to believe that might made right or face the implications of their own choices. They clustered around Polydectes like scavengers around carrion, their faces bright with the malicious joy that small people felt when they saw greatness humbled. Perseus smiled,
And there was something in that smile that should have warned the king, should have reminded him that heroes who survived impossible quests were not the same men who had accepted them. As you wish, your majesty. But first let my mother stand free beside me. Let all who have been loyal witness my gift to you, while those who have chosen cruelty receive what they have earned. Danae was brought forward, her face pale but proud, her eyes bright with tears of joy, at seeing her son alive, at witnessing his return from a quest that should have meant death. The good people of the island, those who had shown kindness to Perseus and his mother, who had remained loyal despite the pressure to conform, who had chosen integrity over safety, gathered to one side of the hall, the corrupt courtiers and cruel guards, those who had enabled Polydectes' tyranny, who had participated in his cruelties, who had chosen power over principle, remained clustered around their king, like moths around a flame that was about to consume them. Now, Perseus said, reaching into his bag with the careful precision of someone handling something infinitely dangerous, receive your wedding gift, King Polydectes. Receive exactly what you deserve. He drew forth Medusa's head, and in that instant, justice found its voice and spoke with the authority of divine will and mortal courage combined. Polydectes and his evil followers turned to stone where they stood, their expressions of cruel amusement becoming eternal, their sneers preserved in marble that would weather 1,000 storms, but would never again speak words of cruelty or command acts of injustice. The king's sneer became his epitaph, carved in stone that would serve as a warning to future tyrants that evil might triumph for a time, but heroes would always rise to restore the balance. Justice for once had teeth, but even with Polydectes defeated and his mother freed, even with Andromeda at his side, and his impossible quest completed, Perseus's story was not finished, for prophecies once spoken must always find their fulfillment. Perseus made Dictys's younger brother, a man of honor who had quietly opposed the king's cruelties without having the power to prevent them, the new ruler of Seriphos. It was a choice that honored his foster father's memory while ensuring that the island would be governed by someone who understood the difference between authority and tyranny, between power and justice. He took his mother and his bride and sailed for Argos, the kingdom of his grandfather, following currents that carried them toward the confrontation that had been destined since his birth. It was time to reclaim Danae's birthright, time to face the prophecy that had shaped his entire life, time to discover whether fate could be fulfilled with honor rather than horror. King Acrisius, now old and haunted by dreams of death, by visions of the grandson he had tried to destroy returning, to claim the throne and the vengeance that justice demanded, heard that Perseus was coming. The oracle's words echoed in his mind like the sound of approaching thunder. Your daughter's son will kill you, rather than face his fate with the dignity that befitted a king, rather than meet his destiny with courage. Acrisius chose the path of cowards and fled his own kingdom. He became a homeless exile, wandering from court to court, seeking shelter with distant relatives, living in terror of shadows that might hide his grandson's approach. He had spent years running from a prophecy that was patient and thorough, that would find him regardless of where he fled or how carefully he hid. Perseus ruled Argos justly and well, understanding that kingship was a responsibility rather than a privilege, that power existed to serve justice rather than personal desire. He and Andromeda raised children who would become heroes in their own right, who would carry their parents' legacy into future generations, who would prove that love could triumph over hate and courage could overcome any curse. The kingdom prospered under their rule, but Perseus never forgot the grandfather who had cast him into the sea as an infant. Not from hatred, Perseus was not a man who nursed grudges or sought revenge for its own sake, but because he understood that some debts must be paid, some circles must be closed, some prophecies must be allowed to fulfill themselves in their own time and their own way. Years passed, peaceful and productive, filled with the kind of happiness that heroes rarely achieved. Perseus and Andromeda grew old together, their love deepening with time, their partnership becoming the foundation for a dynasty that would shape the ancient world. But fate was patient, and fate was thorough, and fate never forgot a prophecy spoken in divine truth. And so it was that Perseus attended funeral games in a neighboring kingdom, participating in the athletic competitions that honored the dead and celebrated the living, never knowing that among the spectators sat an old man who had once been a king. The games were held in honor of a deceased monarch, one of those elaborate festivals that combined religious observance with athletic competition, that brought together heroes and nobles from across the Greek world to compete in contests that tested skill and strength in divine favor. Perseus competed in the discus throw, as heroes often did at such events, his cast strong and true, worthy of his divine heritage and mortal training. But the wind, that fickle servant of gods and fate, caught the bronze disc and carried it further than anyone expected, further than any mortal throw should have reached, into the crowd of spectators who had gathered to watch heroes display their prowess. The disc spun through the air like a messenger of destiny, following a path that had been determined before the first Olympic Games, before the first hero had thrown the first discus. There it struck an elderly man in the chest, a man whose hair had gone white with years of exile, whose face bore the lines of someone who had lived too long with fear and regret. The blow killed him instantly, not from malice or intention, but from the simple accident that brings all prophecies to their inevitable conclusion. Only after the man was dead, only after Perseus had rushed to his side and knelt beside the body in grief and shock, did someone recognize him. Acrisius, the former king of Argos, who had spent years running from a prophecy that found him anyway, who had died not through his grandson's malice, but through the workings of fate that no mortal power could prevent or predict.
Perseus wept when he learned what he had done, understanding the terrible irony that had shaped his entire life, grieving for the grandfather he had never known, mourning the fear that had driven them both toward this moment. But he understood that this was not murder. This was fate. This was the closing of a circle that had been drawn before his birth. This was the proof that prophecies were not threats but simply descriptions of what must be. He buried his grandfather with honors, built his tomb with his own hands, and marked it with words that honored both the king Acrisius had been and the fear that had destroyed him. Perseus ruled Argos with the wisdom that came from understanding that we are all in the end servants of a destiny greater than ourselves, that the future shapes us as much as we shape the future. Perseus lived a long life, longer than most heroes were granted, long enough to see his children grow to greatness, his kingdom flourish, his name become legend. And when at last he joined his ancestors, when his mortal life ended, and his immortal story began, the gods themselves honored him by placing him among the stars, along with Andromeda, his eternal queen. On clear nights when the air is still and the sky is dark, you can still see them there, Perseus with his sword raised against the darkness, Andromeda with her arms stretched toward freedom, their love written in light across the eternity of space. And sometimes when the wind is right and the moon is dark, travelers tell of seeing a figure flying across the night sky, carrying a bag that holds something too terrible to name, still protecting the world from monsters that should not be disturbed. For Perseus learned something that night in the Gorgon's lair, something that all true heroes must learn, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what must be done despite the terror. That wisdom is knowing when to look away, and when to strike true. That love is stronger than death, honor more valuable than life, and justice more important than personal safety. And that sometimes the most impossible tasks become possible when gods and mortals work together toward justice, when divine power serves mortal courage, when fate itself bends before the force of love and determination. Sleep well, sleepless historian. Dream of winged sandals and silver shields, of love that conquers death and courage that turns prophecy into triumph. Dream of Perseus, the hero who looked evil in the face and never blinked, who faced the impossible and made it possible, who proved that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from divine blood but from mortal heart. For in your dreams perhaps you too can learn to fly. Days turned to seasons in that bronze tomb. Danae, who had once danced in palace gardens and felt sea breezes in her hair, now knew only the echo of her own voice against metal walls. She counted time by the patterns of light that filtered down from above, pale and thin, like hope growing weaker. But the gods, especially Zeus, do not respect the walls of mortals. One afternoon, as Danae lay in her bronze prison, something impossible began to happen. The air itself seemed to shimmer. Golden light, warm and alive, began to pour through the smallest cracks in her ceiling. Not ordinary light, this moved like liquid, like honey poured from heaven itself. Zeus had chosen his form, a shower of golden rain, and as that divine essence filled her chamber, Danae felt something she hadn't experienced in years: wonder. The golden rain swirled around her, gentle as a caress, and in that impossible moment, Perseus was conceived. 9 months later, King Acrisius would discover that you cannot imprison the will of the gods, and his greatest fear was about to become his greatest test. When the child's cries echoed up from the bronze chamber, Acrisius felt his blood turn to ice. He rushed to the opening and peered down, and there, impossible, unthinkable, was his daughter holding an infant son. The prophecy had found its way even into his perfect prison. Now Acrisius faced a terrible choice. He could murder them both, but the gods would surely punish him for killing his own blood. He could raise the boy himself, but then he'd be nurturing his own death. So he chose a third path, one that let him sleep at night, while still condemning them to almost certain death. He ordered a wooden chest to be built, large enough for a woman and child but small enough to be carried by 4 men. As the sun set, he had Danae and baby Perseus sealed inside this floating coffin and cast into the wine-dark sea. The waves took them quickly, carrying them away from Argos, away from the known world, into the realm of Poseidon, where only gods and sea monsters decided who lived or died. For 3 days and nights, that chest rode the waves, and inside a mother sang lullabies to her son, while waiting to discover whether they were sailing toward salvation or death. The chest drifted across waters that have no names, past islands that appear on no maps. Danae held Perseus close, her voice growing hoarse from singing, her hope growing thin, as her water ran low. But on the 3rd dawn, as the first light touched the waves, she heard something beautiful: the sound of surf against sand. They had reached Seriphos, a small island where fishermen cast their nets in waters blessed by gods, and it was one of these fishermen, Dictys, who saw the strange chest bobbing in his nets. When he pried it open and found a woman and child inside, alive but barely, he didn't hesitate. He took them to his humble home, gave them food and shelter, and asked no questions about their impossible arrival. Dictys was a good man, and good men were rare in that age. He raised Perseus as his own son, teaching him to fish, to read the stars, to understand the rhythms of sea and season. The boy grew strong and quick-witted, with eyes that seemed to hold starlight, and a smile that won hearts throughout the island. But Perseus carried something in his blood, a restlessness, a hunger for more than the simple life of a fisherman. And as he reached manhood, that divine heritage began to show itself in ways that drew attention. It was this very quality, this spark of something greater, that would soon catch the eye of someone dangerous, someone who would set Perseus on a path toward the most terrifying monster in all the ancient world. King Polydectes ruled Seriphos, with the casual cruelty of small men given power. He was not evil in the grand sense, not a tyrant who burned cities or sacrificed children to dark gods, but he was petty, lustful, and completely without honor. And when he saw Danae now grown into a woman of extraordinary beauty, he decided he wanted her for his wife. There was just one problem: Perseus. The young man had appointed himself his mother's protector, and he was not the kind to step aside politely when a king came calling. Polydectes needed to remove this obstacle,
but he couldn't simply have Perseus killed. The young man was too well loved on the island, and besides, he had a reputation for cleverness that made direct confrontation unwise. So Polydectes chose cunning. He announced his intention to marry Hippodamia, a distant princess, and declared that every man on the island must bring him a wedding gift worthy of such a union. The other islanders brought horses, precious vessels, fine weapons, but Perseus, who owned nothing but the clothes on his back and his father's fishing nets, found himself empty-handed. This was exactly what Polydectes had hoped for. In front of the entire court, he smiled his coldest smile and spoke the words that would change Perseus's life forever. "Since you have no gift suitable for a king, perhaps you could bring me something truly impressive. Bring me the head of Medusa, the Gorgon, whose gaze turns men to stone." The court fell silent. Everyone knew this was not a request, it was a death sentence. No one who had ever sought Medusa had returned. But Perseus looked King Polydectes in the eye, and spoke words that would echo through legend. "I accept," Perseus said simply, and with those two words he sealed his fate, though whether it would be death or glory, only the gods knew. The Gorgons were three sisters, born from ancient sea deities in the early days of the world. Their names were Stheno, Euryala and Medusa. The first two were immortal, their bronze hands and golden wings eternal, their gaze deadly beyond measure. But Medusa was mortal, which meant she could be killed. It also meant she could suffer. Once she had been beautiful, so beautiful that Poseidon himself had desired her, and in his typical fashion, he had taken what he wanted by force, right in Athena's sacred temple. But instead of punishing Poseidon for what goddess dares challenge the earth shaker, Athena had turned her rage on the victim. She transformed Medusa's lovely hair into writhing snakes, made her face so hideous that anyone who looked upon it would turn instantly to stone. Now Medusa lived at the edge of the world, in a place where night never lifted, surrounded by the stone statues of heroes and kings and common men who had tried to slay her and failed. It was to this place that Perseus would have to travel, somehow kill an unkillable monster, and return with proof of his deed. But Perseus had something those other heroes lacked. Not just courage or skill, but something rarer and more powerful, the favor of the gods themselves. Athena came to him first, her gray eyes reflecting depths of wisdom and calculation. She had her own reasons for wanting Medusa dead. The monster's very existence was a reminder of her own harsh justice, and perhaps, in her divine heart, she felt something like regret. She gave Perseus a shield, polished to mirror brightness, and spoke words that would save his life. "Never look directly at the Gorgon, use only reflections." Hermes arrived next, swift-footed and grinning, carrying gifts that defied mortal understanding. Winged sandals that would carry Perseus through the air as easily as a man walks on earth. A curved sword, adamantine, and sharp enough to cut through bronze, through bone, through the very fabric of the world. And most importantly, directions to the Grayes, the Grey sisters, who shared a single eye and tooth between them, and who alone knew the secret path to the Gorgon's lair. The Graye lived at the very edge of civilization, in a twilight realm where day and night blurred together. Three ancient women, gray-haired and gray-skinned, sitting by their gray fire, passing their single eye from hand to hand so each could take her turn at seeing. Perseus watched them from hiding, learning their rhythm, waiting for his moment. And when that moment came, Perseus moved with a speed and cleverness that would have made Hermes himself proud. As one sister passed the eye to another, Perseus darted forward and snatched it from between them. Suddenly blind, the Graye wailed and clawed the air, searching for their precious sight. Perseus held it just out of reach and spoke, "I have your eye, grandmothers. Tell me the path to the Gorgon's lair, and I'll return it to you." They had no choice. In voices like rustling leaves, they told him of the nymphs who guarded the sacred items he would need. Hades' helm of invisibility, which would hide him from the Gorgon's sight. a magical bag that could contain Medusa's head without the bearer turning to stone, and most crucially, the exact location of the Gorgon's resting place. Perseus returned their eye and flew westward, following directions that led him past the Pillars of Heracles, beyond the edge of maps, to islands that existed only in the dreams of the most desperate sailors. There he found the nymphs beautiful beyond description, eternal and kind, who looked at this young mortal with something like maternal affection. They gave him everything the Graia had promised, and something more, words of encouragement. "You carry the blood of Zeus," they told him, "and sometimes, mortal courage burns brighter than divine power." Armed with gifts from gods and nymphs, Perseus finally turned toward his destination. But nothing, not divine favor, not magical weapons, not all the courage in the world could prepare him for what he would find at the edge of darkness. The Gorgon's lair lay beyond the western ocean, in a realm where Atlas held up the sky, and the sun's chariot never rode. Perseus flew through air that grew colder and thinner, over waves that reflected no light, toward a darkness that seemed to swallow even hope. He smelled them before he saw them, the copper scent of blood, the sweet decay of death, something else that had no name but made his stomach clench with primal fear. Then he saw the statues, hundreds of them, thousands, an army of stone figures stretching as far as his eyes could see in the dim light. Warriors in mid-charge, their swords raised, their mouths open in battle cries that would never come. Sailors with their hands shading their eyes, still searching for home. Kings and beggars and children, all frozen in their final moments, all victims of a single glance. And beyond them, in a grove of trees that bore no leaves, the Gorgon slept. Perseus activated Hades' helm and vanished from sight. Step by careful step, he moved through the forest of the dead, his winged sandals carrying him silently over ground littered with broken weapons and crumbling bones. His heart hammered so loudly he was certain it would wake them, but the Gorgon slept on. Now came the moment that would define him forever. Perseus raised Athena's shield, angled it just so, and in its polished surface he saw the face that had launched 1,000 nightmares. Even in reflection, even dulled by bronze, Medusa's visage was terrible beyond words. Her hair writhed with serpents, each one alive, each one watching with eyes like black pearls. Her face was still recognizably that of a woman, but twisted into something that belonged in the deepest pits of Tartarus. Her bronze skin gleamed with an oily sheen, and her lips, pulled back in an eternal snarl, revealed teeth like broken glass. But Perseus looked, and Perseus did not turn to stone, because he looked only at her reflection. With movements precise as a surgeon's, he raised Hermes' blade, and brought it down in one swift stroke. The sword passed through flesh and bone as if they were mist. Medusa's head rolled free, her serpent hair still writhing, her eyes still deadly even in death. But Perseus was ready. Without looking, guided only by the sound, he swept the head into the magical bag. The instant Medusa died, her sisters woke. Their screams shattered the air like breaking crystal, and they rose into the night sky, on their golden wings, claws extended, seeking vengeance. But Perseus was already invisible, already flying, already racing toward home with his impossible prize. Behind him, the Gorgon's cries faded into distance. Ahead lay the long journey home. But Perseus carried with him something that would change not just his fate, but the fate of everyone whose life he touched.
From Medusa's blood, as it dripped onto the earth, sprang two impossible children, Pegasus the winged horse whose hoofbeats would thunder across the sky, and Chrysaor the golden-armed warrior who would found kingdoms. Even in death, the Gorgon's power created wonders. Perseus flew eastward, carrying his burden carefully, never looking into the bag, never relaxing his vigilance. The head of Medusa was perhaps the most dangerous object in all the world, a weapon that could turn armies to stone with a single glance. But fate was not finished with Perseus yet. As he passed over the coast of Ethiopia, he heard sounds that made him pause.
the crash of waves against stone, and beneath it something else. The sound of weeping. He descended through clouds and mist and saw a sight that would haunt his dreams forever. A young woman chained to a sea rock, her white dress whipping in the wind, her dark hair streaming like a banner. The tide was rising around her feet, and in the distance, something vast and terrible was moving beneath the waves. This was Andromeda, princess of Ethiopia, and she was about to die for her mother's vanity. But Perseus was about to discover that sometimes the greatest heroism comes not from seeking glory, but from simply refusing to look away when others suffer. The story was simple and terrible, as the best stories often are. Queen Cassiopeia, Andromeda's mother, had boasted that her daughter was more beautiful than the Nereids, the sea nymphs who attended Poseidon. Such hubris never goes unpunished by the gods. Poseidon had sent a sea monster to ravage the Ethiopian coast, and the oracle declared that only one sacrifice could appease the god's wrath. Andromeda herself must be chained to the rocks and given to the beast. Perseus hovered above the scene, torn between his mission and his conscience. He could continue home, complete his quest, save his mother from Polydectes' unwanted attention, or he could intervene, risk everything he had gained, for a stranger whose only crime was being born to a foolish mother. He looked at Andromeda's face. Beautiful, yes, but more than that, brave. She was not screaming or pleading with the gods. She faced her death with a dignity that humbled him. The choice when it came was not really a choice at all. Perseus descended like a falling star, drawing his sword, calling out to the princess, "Look away. No matter what you hear, do not turn your eyes toward me." The sea monster that rose from the depths was nightmare given form, but Perseus had learned something important in the Gorgon's lair. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is not strength, but the wisdom to use your enemy's power against them. The beast was everything the ocean fears, condensed into living flesh, tentacles thick as tree trunks, eyes like pools of black water, teeth that could shatter ships. It surged toward Andromeda with hunger that had been building for weeks. But Perseus was ready. As the monster lunged, he reached into his bag and drew forth Medusa's head. Even the sea beast could not resist the Gorgon's final curse. Its roar cut off mid-bellow as its flesh turned to stone, and it sank beneath the waves like a mountain falling. Perseus quickly concealed the head again and flew to Andromeda's side. As he broke her chains, she looked at him with eyes that held stars, and Perseus felt something he had never experienced before. Not the thrill of battle, or the satisfaction of victory, but something deeper and more dangerous. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Someone who believes beautiful women should not die for their mother's mistakes," he replied. But their escape from Ethiopia would prove to be only the beginning of their trials, for Perseus still had to return home, claim his victory over Polydectes, and confront the prophecy that had started it all. They flew together across the wine-dark sea, Andromeda in Perseus's arms, both of them marveling at the impossible turn their lives had taken. She told him of her homeland, of the books she had read in her father's library, of her dreams of seeing the world beyond Ethiopia's borders. He told her of his mission, of his mother imprisoned by a tyrant's lust, of the destiny that had driven him to the edge of the world and back. By the time they reached Seriphos, they knew they would never part again. But the island they found was not the peaceful fishing community Perseus remembered. Polydectes had grown tired of waiting. He had taken Danae by force, imprisoned her in his palace, and declared himself her husband whether she willed it or not. Dictys, the kind fisherman who had raised Perseus, lay dead, killed for trying to protect her. Perseus felt rage like he had never known, pure and clean and terrible. He walked into Polydectes' palace with Andromeda at his side, through corridors lined with the king's guards, into the great hall where the tyrant sat on his stolen throne. "I have returned," Perseus announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent hall, "and I have brought the gift you requested." Polydectes laughed, thinking himself safe behind his guards and his power.
But he had forgotten something important about Perseus. The young man had learned to turn impossible situations to his advantage. "You expect me to believe you have actually slain Medusa," Polydectes sneered. "Show me this great trophy, hero. Show us all your supposed victory." Perseus smiled, and there was something in that smile that should have warned the king. "As you wish. But first let my mother stand free beside me. Let all who have been loyal witness my gift to you." Danae was brought forward, her face pale but proud. The good people of the island, those who had shown kindness to Perseus and his mother, gathered to one side. The corrupt courtiers and cruel guards stood with their king. "Now," Perseus said, reaching into his bag, "receive your wedding gift." He drew forth Medusa's head, and in that instant, Polydectes and his evil followers turned to stone, where they stood. The king's sneer became eternal, carved in marble that would weather 1,000 storms. Justice for once had teeth. But even with Polydectes defeated and his mother freed, Perseus's story was not finished. For prophecies once spoken must always find their fulfillment. Perseus made Dictys' younger brother king of Seriphos, a man of honor who would rule justly. He took his mother and his bride and sailed for Argos, the kingdom of his grandfather, to reclaim Danae's birthright and finally confront the prophecy that had shaped his entire life. King Acrisius, now old and haunted by dreams of death, heard that Perseus was coming. The oracle's words echoed in his mind. "Your daughter's son will kill you." Rather than face his fate, Acrisius fled his own kingdom, leaving Argos to wander as a homeless exile. Perseus ruled justly and well, but he never forgot the grandfather who had cast him into the sea as an infant. Not from hatred. Perseus was not a man who nursed grudges, but because he understood that some debts must be paid, some circles must be closed. Years passed. Perseus and Andromeda raised children who would become heroes in their own right. The kingdom prospered, but fate was patient, and fate was thorough. And so it was that Perseus attended funeral games in a neighboring kingdom, never knowing that among the spectators sat an old man who had once been a king. Perseus competed in the discus throw, as heroes often did at such events. His cast was mighty, worthy of his divine heritage. But the wind caught the bronze disc and carried it further than anyone expected, into the crowd of spectators. There it struck an elderly man in the chest, killing him instantly. Only after the man was dead did someone recognize him. Acrisius, the former king of Argos, who had spent years running from a prophecy that found him anyway. Perseus wept when he learned what he had done, but he understood. This was not murder. This was fate. The oracle's words had come true, not through malice or planning, but through the simple accident that brings all prophecies to their conclusion. He buried his grandfather with honors, built his tomb with his own hands, and ruled Argos with the wisdom that comes from understanding that we are all in the end servants of a destiny greater than ourselves. Perseus lived a long life, longer than most heroes were granted. He saw his children grow to greatness, his kingdom flourish, his name become legend, and when at last he joined his ancestors, the gods placed him among the stars, along with Andromeda, his eternal queen. On clear nights, you can still see them there. Perseus with his sword raised, Andromeda with her arms stretched toward freedom, their love written in light across the darkness of eternity. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the moon is dark, travelers tell of seeing a figure flying across the night sky, carrying a bag that holds something too terrible to name, still protecting the world from monsters that should not be disturbed. For Perseus learned something that night in the Gorgon's lair, something that all true heroes must learn, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what must be done despite the terror. That wisdom is knowing when to look away, and when to strike true, and that sometimes, the most impossible tasks become possible when gods and mortals work together toward justice. Sleep well, sleepless historian. Dream of winged sandals and silver shields. of love that conquers death and courage that turns prophecy into triumph. Dream of Perseus, the hero who looked evil in the face and never blinked, for in your dreams, perhaps you too can learn to fly.